introducing a breakthrough in portraiture camera technology.
Look, all he's trying to tell you...
Gals like us who have to keep our weight down and our vitality up.
Them all here. They always follow me.
They were the brands that lit up childhoods, filled living rooms, and ruled our malls until they vanished like they never mattered. What happened to the icons we trusted? And why does it feel like losing them meant losing part of ourselves? There was a moment in time when Betamax by Sony felt like the future. It had better video quality, a sleeker build, and came from a company America respected. But the future is not always decided by quality. It is decided by marketing, accessibility, and sometimes dumb luck. As families across the United States tried to tape late-night movies and birthday parties, VHS was waiting in the wings with longer record times and cheaper manufacturing. Sony clung to Betamax like it was a crown jewel, refusing to open the format to other producers. Meanwhile, JVC made sure VHS was everywhere. Department stores, rental shops, even those weird catalogs your uncle subscribed to. Betamax became the expensive outsider, and slowly, painfully, it vanished. What makes it worse is how many people swore it was better. You hear it even now, that Betamax was sharper, that it deserved to win, but it did not, and the shelves emptied and the VCRs were unplugged. We talk a lot about technology moving too fast, but this was a case of the better tech losing the race. People did not just throw out a tape, they threw out a bet on something they believed in. That loss still stings for those who remember. Braniff International Airways was not just an airline. It was a fashion show in the sky, a flying work of art with orange planes, purple interiors, and flight attendants dressed by Halston. It was the kind of thing only the 1970s could dream up, and only the 1970s could destroy. It started with color and glamour. People felt like royalty walking onto a Braniff jet, but underneath the paint and press photos was a brutal truth. The airline industry was changing. Gas prices were soaring. Deregulation was coming. Braniff spent money like it was printing it, buying more jets, building grander lounges, and betting big on routes it could not afford. When the economy crashed and fuel costs doubled, Braniff found itself choking on luxury. Passengers stopped flying for style. They wanted cheap. They wanted direct. They wanted reliable. Braniff had become a symbol of excess in a decade no longer willing to pay for it. By the time it folded in 1982, people barely blinked. The planes were grounded, the bright colors faded, and the dream of glamorous air travel took one final nosedive. Ask anyone who flew Braniff in its prime. They will smile, maybe even tear up. Then they will tell you it never stood a chance. The American Motors Corporation was not supposed to die. It was supposed to be the little guy that held the line. In a market dominated by giants like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, AMC dared to be different. It gave us the Gremlin, the Hornet, and the Pacer, cars that looked like nothing else on the road. But that difference came at a cost. AMC was always scrambling for cash. Its designs were bold, but sometimes too bold. The Pacer was called a fishbowl on wheels. The Gremlin looked like a prank gone too far. And while America was falling in love with fuel efficiency and sleek imports, AMC clung to its oddball identity. It tried to innovate. It partnered with Renault. It launched the Eagle, a car that would inspire the modern SUV. But none of it was enough. The market was cruel. Interest rates climbed. Gas prices jumped. AMC fell behind on everything: production, marketing, even public opinion. By the time Chrysler bought it out in the late 1980s, it was already a ghost. People do not talk much about AMC now, but they should. Because it tried. It really tried. And in the end, that might be what hurts most. Burger Chef once had more locations than McDonald's. That is the part people forget. Before the Golden Arches took over every highway exit and downtown corner, Burger Chef was America's fast food sweetheart. Its secret? The Fun Meal, a direct precursor to the Happy Meal. It gave kids toys, games, and branded packaging years before anyone else did. The burgers were solid, the prices were right, and families loved it. But then came the lawsuits, the missteps, the slow bleed of bad business decisions. Hardee's bought them out, closed down locations, and erased the name almost overnight. Some buildings stayed standing for years, sun-faded signs above cracked pavement. You would drive past them and remember the taste, the toy, the tray that made you feel like the meal was yours. What happened to Burger Chef was not just corporate takeover, it was theft by attrition, a slow-motion forgetting of something that once mattered. Ask anyone over 50 if they remember it, and their eyes light up. But there are no new stories being made. No drive-thrus, no jingles, no future, just memories. And that, for a brand that once brought so much joy, feels like a tragedy no one saw coming. Schiaparelli perfumes once lived in the same breathless league as Chanel and Dior. With their surrealist bottles and bold floral compositions, they brought high fashion to the dressing tables of everyday American women. It was not just a scent, it was a statement. In the 1970s, Schiaparelli's legacy still lingered, but America was shifting. Fashion was getting younger, louder, and more synthetic. The brand struggled to adapt. Department stores gave shelf space to trendier, punchier names. The old-world elegance of Schiaparelli felt out of step in a decade of disco and denim. And somewhere along the way, the company let go of its American foothold. Licensing fell apart. Distribution waned. What had once been a symbol of European sophistication became something whispered about in vintage shops. Women who once dabbed it on before dinner parties now found their favorite scents discontinued, forgotten. For some, it was just a bottle, but for others, it was identity. A sense of self wrapped in rose and bergamot, and losing that, quietly, without warning, felt like losing a part of the woman they once were. Woolco was supposed to be the next evolution of Woolworths. It had the size of a department store and the soul of a five and dime. Launched in the 1960s and booming into the 1970s, Woolco promised everything in one place: clothes, toys, appliances, groceries. For families used to making a dozen different stops, it felt like magic. A bright red sign that said you could get it all without going broke. But behind that promise was chaos. Poor inventory systems, outdated layouts, stores too big to manage and too cluttered to navigate. And then came the competition. Kmart, Target, Walmart. Retail giants with cleaner shelves, sharper prices, and better supply chains. Woolco could not keep up. It became the store you only visited when you had to. The store where the lights buzzed too loud and the shelves were always half empty. By the 1980s, most Woolcos had either been shut down or sold off. Some were turned into malls, others just disappeared, and with them went a small piece of how we used to shop, wandering the aisles on Saturday mornings, dreaming about toys, picking out socks with mom. Woolco was not perfect, but it was familiar, and we miss it more than we admit. Pan American World Airways was not just a brand, it was a symbol, a ticket to the world stamped in blue and white, with flight attendants in crisp uniforms and ads that made the world seem smaller and more elegant. For much of the 20th century, flying Pan Am meant you had made it. But by the 1970s, the cracks were showing. Oil prices spiked, air travel deregulated, competition exploded, and Pan Am, bloated with international routes and expensive aircraft, could not adapt fast enough. It tried new services, rebranded its cabins, and even launched a short-lived domestic push. But nothing stuck. The glory days were gone, and the bills kept coming. By the early 1990s, it was over. Planes grounded, staff laid off, logos fading from airports and travel posters. For many Americans, Pan Am was their first flight, their first window seat, their first glimpse of the clouds from above. To watch it fall felt like watching the future turn to dust. It was more than a business loss. It was a goodbye to the golden age of travel. Datsun was everywhere in the 1970s. Sleek, reliable, affordable. The kind of car your neighbor drove, your cousin saved up for, and your dad secretly liked better than his American sedan. It was Japan's Trojan horse into the United States market, and it worked brilliantly. But success brought identity problems. Nissan, its parent company, wanted global consistency. They did not want to be Datsun in one country and Nissan in another. So in the early 1980s, the decision was made: rebrand. Slowly, Datsun vanished. The name was pulled from brochures, badges, and showrooms. And just like that, a brand that millions had trusted was gone. People were confused. Dealerships had to explain that Nissan and Datsun were the same. Some buyers walked away. The transition was rocky, and for a while, Nissan lost ground in the market it had fought so hard to win. Looking back, the choice makes sense. But it still feels like something was stolen. A name, a memory, a piece of the road. Record Bar was not just a store, it was a ritual. A place where teenagers went to spend their last few dollars on a cassette, where college students flipped through vinyl with purpose, and where parents hunted for the next hit their kids could play too loud. The smell of shrink wrap, the sound of headphones clamped over your ears, that feeling of holding a new album like it was a treasure. In the 1970s and 1980s, Record Bar was in malls across America. It was part of the cultural fabric. But time moved on. Music got smaller. First the CD, then the download, and finally the invisible stream. Malls lost their sparkle, the ritual faded, and Record Bar, like so many others, folded under the weight of a world that no longer needed it. The music still plays, but the experience is gone. You can click a button now, but you will never get that feeling again. That quiet buzz of possibility as you stepped through the door. High Karate aftershave was a joke and a phenomenon all at once. It came in a cheap bottle with a commercial that turned masculinity into a parody of itself. Spray this on, and women would attack you. Literally. The ads were absurd, over the top, and completely unforgettable. But behind the humor was a surprisingly decent scent. High Karate became the go-to for teenage boys trying to smell grown up and grown men trying to stay playful. It was the cologne you found in your dad's drawer next to the tie clips and old movie stubs. But the joke wore thin. Trends shifted. The 1980s wanted power and polish, not camp and chaos. High Karate was quietly discontinued. Stores stopped stocking it. The bottles became rare. Today, it is a punchline for some and a scent memory for others. A whiff of what it meant to be young, to be bold, to believe that a fragrance could change everything. There was a time when TWA meant elegance, a time when stepping onto a trans-world airlines flight was like entering a luxury hotel in the sky. The seats were wide, the service crisp, the logo iconic. From movie stars to newlyweds, everyone wanted to fly TWA. It was part of the golden age of air travel. But by the 1970s, the clouds were darkening. Deregulation hit hard. New competitors raced into the skies, offering faster routes and cheaper fares. Fuel prices soared, labor disputes dragged on, and TWA's once glorious reputation began to buckle. What once felt like flying with royalty now felt outdated and expensive. Suddenly, the airline of tomorrow had become yesterday's news. It expanded too quickly, bought too many jets, and could not keep up with the ruthless economics of modern air travel. Bankruptcy became a familiar word. By the time American Airlines absorbed what remained in the early 2000s, the brand was already a shadow. Airports removed the signs, crews traded uniforms, but the memory lingered. For anyone who flew TWA during its heyday, there was nothing like it. Now, it is a name buried under decades of debt and nostalgia, a ghost with wings. Plymouth was never the flashiest name on the road, but it was trusted, reliable, American. It was the car your uncle fixed up in the driveway, the station wagon that took families to the Grand Canyon, the compact that young drivers learned to parallel park with. In the 1970s, Plymouth had already seen better days, but there was still hope. Then the market shifted. Gas prices spiked, Japanese imports hit harder and faster than anyone expected, and Plymouth's offerings started to feel outdated. Chrysler focused its attention elsewhere. Dodge got the performance, Chrysler got the luxury, and Plymouth got what was left. People still bought them, but it felt like settling. You were not proud to drive a Plymouth. you were just glad it still ran. Sales dipped. Innovation stalled. Even iconic models like the Duster could not save the brand. The writing was on the wall. By the 1990s, Plymouth was a forgotten middle child, unloved and unnecessary. In 2001, Chrysler officially pulled the plug. For decades, Plymouth had been a quiet part of the American story. And now, it is a footnote. But the memories remain in faded photos, old commercials, and the sound of an engine that will not come back. In the 1970s, Vivitar cameras were everywhere. They were not the fanciest, but they worked. They captured birthday parties, backyard barbecues, and road trips to Mount Rushmore. They were affordable, sturdy, and proudly American. For amateur photographers, Vivitar was a ticket to creativity. But behind the shutters and flashbulbs, the world was changing. Japan was coming fast with brands like Nikon, Canon, and Minolta. Their lenses were sharper, their designs sleeker, and their technology more advanced. Vivitar could not keep up. It tried to pivot, offering accessories, licensing deals, and budget versions of premium cameras. Every shelf they lost in a department store was one less memory they would help capture. They were not just losing market share, they were losing their place in the family album. But the market was ruthless. Film was expensive, competition was brutal, and Vivitar slowly fell out of focus. By the time digital cameras arrived, it was too late. What once filled shelves at Sears and Montgomery Ward now sat in garage sales and thrift stores. Forgotten. But ask anyone who grew up in the 1970s to show you their old photo albums. Odds are, a Vivitar helped make those memories. A camera might just be a tool, but for millions of Americans, Vivitar was how they remembered their lives. Esprit was not just fashion. It was a feeling. Youthful, bright, alive. The brand captured a moment when clothes were not just about style, but about saying something. About the world, about identity, about freedom. In the 1970s and 1980s, Esprit exploded across America. Their catalogs were works of art. Their stores were full of color and energy. It felt like the future. You walked into Esprit and felt like the main character in your own story. It was clothes for the bold, not just the fashionable. But fashion moves fast. By the 1990s, trends were changing. Grunge came in, minimalism followed, and Esprit's cheerful aesthetic felt out of place. Management changed. Expansion overreached. And what once felt vibrant, now felt dated. Sales dipped. Stores closed. By the early 2000s, Esprit in the United States was nearly extinct. It survived in Europe and Asia for a while longer, but the magic had faded. For a certain generation, Esprit was the brand they wore to school dances, to mall hangouts, to first dates. It was more than fabric. It was memory, stitched into every sleeve. Now it is a whisper from a closet that no longer opens. Leisure World was not just a retirement community. It was a promise, a dream built on sunshine, shuffleboard, and stress-free living. Born in the 1970s, Leisure World offered gated bliss for seniors, condos, golf carts, social clubs, and security. It was pitched as paradise for the golden years. But paradise costs money. And by the 1980s, cracks started to show. Economic downturns hit retirement savings hard. Fixed incomes did not match rising maintenance fees. And some residents found that the dream came with hidden rules, strict covenants, and unexpected costs. The promise of simplicity turned into a maze of fine print. For many residents, retirement began to feel like a contract they never meant to sign. Lawsuits followed, disputes over control, access, and promises made but not kept. What began as a utopia turned, in many places, into something colder. Today, some Leisure World communities still exist, but the shine is gone. The brochures have aged. The palm trees are the same, but the illusion has faded. For many, it is still home. But for others, it was a broken promise wrapped in sunshine. A reminder that even dreams built in good faith can crack under real pressure. Gino's Hamburgers was a mid-Atlantic icon. With its bold red signs and sports tie-ins, it stood out in a crowded fast food landscape. Kids loved the burgers, adults loved the prices, and everybody loved the connection to football legend Gino Marchetti, who co-founded the chain after retiring from the NFL. It was fast, friendly, and local. In cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia, it was as common as traffic. But Gino's had ambitions beyond the region. It wanted to go national. What felt like a hometown treasure did not always translate outside the neighborhood. The farther it spread, the more it lost the charm that made it matter. The problem was the rest of the country already had their go-to burger joints. McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's. Gino's tried to differentiate. It added Kentucky Fried Chicken to its menu through a partnership. It redesigned stores. But growth was slow. The charm that worked in Baltimore did not translate in California. By the 1980s, Marriott had bought the chain and converted most of the locations into Roy Rogers. Just like that, Gino's was gone. The buildings changed, the signs came down, and a local legend faded into memory. But for those who grew up with it, Gino's was never just a burger. It was home. Before it made video game history, Coleco was just trying to survive. The Connecticut Leather Company, yes, that is what Coleco stood for, started with shoes and evolved into above-ground pools, plastic toys, and electronic gadgets. In the 1970s, it was everywhere, but it was never dominant, always chasing trends. Then came the video game boom. ColecoVision arrived and gave the company its first real taste of national success. The graphics were better, the games felt fresh. For a brief moment in the early 1980s, Coleco looked unstoppable. It felt like they had finally found their niche, a lane where they could lead instead of follow. But success came faster than the company could stabilize, but it did not last. The video game crash of 1983 hit like a hammer. Coleco overextended, banking on a market that evaporated almost overnight. It tried to pivot again, launching the Cabbage Patch Kids dolls, which sold in the millions. But lightning rarely strikes twice. Manufacturing problems, patent lawsuits, financial strain. By the end of the decade, Coleco was bankrupt, sold off, dismantled, and the dreams of a plastic empire turned to dust. For anyone who grew up in that era, Coleco was part of the magic, part of the joy, part of the fall. In the late 1970s, Vidal Sassoon was more than a brand. It was a movement. The salons, the products, the commercials. If you do not look good, we do not look good. It was bold, sharp, and full of promise. The Vidal Sassoon salons offered high-end haircuts with a modern edge. Women felt transformed. Men took notice. It was more than a trim. It was a lifestyle. You were not just getting a haircut. You were getting modernized, elevated, made new. For many, it was the first time they felt stylish instead of simply presentable. But like many trends, it struggled to evolve. The early 1980s brought new fashion rules, big hair, wild volume. Sassoon's geometric precision began to feel too rigid, too old. Franchises thinned. The elite vibe became a burden, not a benefit. Meanwhile, cheaper salons, home styling kits, and new celebrity stylists flooded the market. The salons faded. The products moved to drugstore shelves. And the name that once meant sophistication became just another bottle in the aisle. But there was a time, brief, electric, when getting your hair done at Vidal Sassoon felt like stepping into the future. And losing that future stung more than people admit. Olympia beer was not flashy. It was not exotic. It was the working man's brew. Born in Washington State and famous for its "It is the water" slogan, Olympia carved out a loyal base across the Pacific Northwest. It tasted like fishing trips, union picnics, and back porch summers. You did not drink it to impress anyone. You drank it because it was yours. But the beer wars were brutal. Big national brands like Budweiser and Miller came swinging with huge ad budgets and coast-to-coast reach. Olympia tried to expand, but its regional charm did not scale well. The further it traveled from the rivers and forests of its home, the more it lost its soul. What made it special could not be bottled and shipped across state lines. It was bought out, reformulated, stripped of its identity. By the 1980s, the writing was on the wall. The original brewery closed, the taste changed, and loyal drinkers quietly moved on. Today, Olympia still exists in name, brewed by a different company in a different place. But those who remember the real thing will tell you, it is not the same. And maybe it never could be. Clark Equipment Company once helped build America. Its construction vehicles, forklifts, and loaders were staples on job sites across the country. From highways to factories, if something big was being built, Clark was likely there. The brand stood for toughness and reliability. But the 1970s brought headwinds. Inflation climbed, industrial jobs declined, foreign competitors offered cheaper alternatives, and Clark, heavy with overhead and tradition, struggled to pivot. Its innovation slowed, its market share shrank. Machines once seen as symbols of progress started to look like dinosaurs. You could still find them in use, but fewer every year. Workers were laid off. Plants closed. By the 1980s, it was a name people remembered, not one they relied on. Pieces of the company were sold, reorganized, absorbed. What remained was a fragmented legacy. Ask a retired construction worker or a union foreman from the era, and they will nod. They will remember the green machines, the noise, the muscle. Clark Equipment Company did not just lose customers, it lost relevance. And in the business of building, that is the one thing you cannot rebuild. There was a time when S&H Green Stamps were as good as cash. You collected them with every grocery run, every gas station stop, every purchase that counted. And then you filled the little books. Carefully, patiently, with the pride of someone building something out of nothing. Families traded them in for toasters, radios, even bicycles. It felt like free rewards for loyalty. A quiet handshake between shopper and store. The moment you tore out a full book and handed it over felt like winning something without spending a dime. For many working-class families, it was the only kind of bonus life ever handed out. But loyalty changed. By the late 1970s, inflation had twisted prices beyond recognition, and stamps felt like yesterday's trick. Credit cards came in, bringing points and cashback offers. Big box stores offered everyday low prices instead of incentives. And suddenly, people did not want to save pages of stamps anymore. They wanted savings now. S&H tried to pivot, offering catalogs, electronics, even vacations. But it was too late. The books sat half-filled in kitchen drawers, forgotten. The redemption centers closed. The stamp became a relic. And with it, the ritual faded. Ask someone who grew up with S&H, and they will smile at the memory. But they will also tell you when it ended, it felt like losing part of what made everyday shopping feel like a game worth playing. The Pontiac Aztek was a disaster in the early 2000s, but its roots stretch back to the 1970s. Back then, car designers were quietly sketching new ideas, crossovers, hybrid shapes, something between a van and an SUV. The oil crisis had made the auto industry rethink everything. What if utility and economy could live in the same shell? Those early concepts never left the drawing board, but they stayed in the shadows, mutating over time. Somewhere between vision and reality, the design lost its soul. What rolled out of the factory felt more like compromise than innovation. And when the market finally seemed ready for something different, Pontiac pulled the trigger. What came out was the Aztek. It was bold. It was weird. It was ahead of its time, and somehow behind it. The angles were wrong. The plastic cladding was cheap, and the name sounded like a dare. Consumers recoiled, sales tanked, and Pontiac, already in trouble, never really recovered. But behind the jokes, behind the Breaking Bad memes and design flops, there was something sad about it all. The Aztek was born from good intentions, from a desire to break the mold and recapture relevance. Instead, it became a punchline. Proof that even bold ideas, especially bold ideas, can fail spectacularly. W.T. Grant was not just a department store, it was a part of the American landscape. In the 1970s, it had over 1,000 locations, main streets, suburban malls, strip centers. W.T. Grant was everywhere. It sold clothes, appliances, hardware, school supplies. You could buy a pair of jeans, a toaster, and a lawn chair in one trip. But behind the counters, trouble brewed. Management wanted growth. and they wanted it fast. Stores were built too quickly. Debt piled up. And worst of all, they handed out credit like candy. Their revolving charge account let customers buy now, pay later, with no real system to check if they could afford it. The trust they gave customers was generous, but fatally blind. W.T. Grant did not just run out of money, it ran out of time. The losses mounted. In 1976, W.T. Grant filed for bankruptcy. It was one of the largest retail collapses in American history. Thousands of workers lost jobs, communities lost familiar storefronts, and shoppers lost a place that felt like home. Unlike other stores that faded quietly, Grant's collapse was loud, public, and painful. It was a warning shot across the bow of American retail. Grow too fast, trust too much, and the walls will fall. People still remember the logo, the way the floors creaked, the smell of new shoes in a cardboard box. But the store itself is gone. Oldsmobile was the brand your grandfather trusted. It was dependable, steady, and proudly American. In the 1970s, it was one of General Motors' most successful lines. The Cutlass was everywhere. Parking lots, driveways, high school graduation gifts. It was a badge of middle-class confidence. But times changed. Japanese automakers brought new efficiency. The luxury market moved to BMW and Mercedes-Benz. And Oldsmobile struggled to define itself. Was it sporty? Was it classic? Was it for young drivers or retirees? The answers never came. Designs grew stale. Performance lagged. The name Oldsmobile started to feel like a joke no one wanted to explain. By the time they rebranded, no one was listening. And the name started to sound old. By the 1990s, Oldsmobile felt like a brand out of time. Sales dropped. Dealers lost faith. General Motors tried to rebrand it, update it, give it a new face. But it was too late. The final Oldsmobile rolled off the line in 2004. For decades, it was the quiet heart of the American road. And then it was gone. Not with a crash, but with a sigh. A slow fade into silence. And if you ever drove one, you remember. The smell of the vinyl seats, the hum of the engine on a long drive. Oldsmobile did not just fail, it retired. The Marlboro Man was one of the most iconic figures in advertising history. Rugged, silent, powerful. He sold more cigarettes than any slogan ever could. But in the 1970s, even the Marlboro brand tried to branch out. Enter Marlboro Milds, a softer version of the cowboy classic, aimed at new smokers, occasional smokers, and anyone who thought the full-strength original was too much. But the strategy backfired. Smokers did not want a mild cowboy. They wanted grit. Marlboro Milds confused the image. It watered down the brand's toughness. The rugged cowboy now sounded like he rode side saddle. And once the image cracked, the whole identity unraveled. Sales never took off. Even heavy advertising could not save it. Marlboro tried to pivot again, releasing new blends and special editions, but the damage was done. Milds quietly vanished from shelves. For a brand built on identity, on image, on ironclad consistency, this experiment was a rare stumble, and it showed how fragile even a giant can be. You can picture the Marlboro Man standing at dusk, wind in his hair, but somewhere off-screen, those failed packs of Milds gather dust, a reminder that even legends make mistakes. Pup and Taco was one of those places that never made it all the way across the country. But for Californians, it was a staple. You knew what to expect. A wide menu, dirt-cheap prices, and a name that sounded like it was made up by a kid. Hot dogs, tacos, burgers, fries, slushies, they threw it all at the wall and somehow it worked. You could walk up, grab a chili dog and a taco, and be out in 5 minutes for under $3. The locations were easy to spot too. Those retro signs with the big red and yellow block letters were a beacon to beach bums and budget-conscious teens alike. There was nothing gourmet about it, but that was never the point. It was fast, it was greasy, and it was loved. So much so, in fact, that Taco Bell bought most of the locations in the 1980s, essentially absorbing Pup and Taco into its own empire. The quirky name might be gone, but the spirit lives on every time someone adds a side of nachos to their burrito order. And while Pup and Taco ruled the roadside, our next stop was the king of the mall food court. Soft, warm, twisted, and salted. The pretzel that walked so others could run. Sambo's was made in 1957 all the way in Santa Barbara, California, and it had an extreme focus on capturing the market for families that wanted good, reliable breakfast options. It was a family restaurant chain known for its diner-style meals and its endearing pancakes, but how did they get their start? I'm not sure what the story was, but Sam Battistone Sr. and Newell Bonnet were the founders of the iconic restaurant chain, and the name was actually supposed to be a fusion of theirs. Personally, I think Sambo sounds a lot better than the other options that could come from those two names, but you let me know how you feel about that. Anyway, they were also known for one other obscure fact that I don't think a lot of you will catch. They were based off of the storybook known as The Story of Little Black Sambo, and a lot of their branding involved that, such as featuring tiger and jungle symbolism instead of outright referencing the book. Maybe because the book was slightly controversial, but the restaurant definitely wasn't, with 1,000 locations in just the 1970s alone. That is, until it did invite controversy. Eventually, Sambo started to become known for its racially insensitive branding, and despite their earnest attempts to rebrand into a more humane style of branding, it was unsuccessful, and it ended up closing down in the 1980s. The business practices it introduced are still followed by places like IHOP in America today, though, such as the idea of serving breakfast at all hours of the day. If we go on over to Miami Beach, Florida, in the 1956 time period, then there were these two brothers who really struck gold and no one saw it coming. The canoe rental shack by the creek was not a business so much as a suggestion. A crooked sign, 3 boats tied to a tree, and a man named Gary who might have been there since 1948. Dad would slap a 20 into Gary's hand and say, "We'll be back in a couple hours," like it was no big deal. No forms, no helmets, no waiver. Just a paddle, a life vest that definitely had not been certified since Eisenhower, and you, wobbling into a canoe while Dad shoved you off the bank with one foot. Once you got going, though, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you realize just how loud life usually is. Birds overhead, water slapping against the side, and Dad telling the same story about how he once saw a snapping turtle the size of a garbage can. You never saw one, but you wanted to. You learned how to steer, sort of, and how to duck when you went under a low branch too late. You got soaked, you laughed, and when you finally dragged the canoe back onto dry land, Dad would clap you on the shoulder like you had just completed Navy SEAL training. But if that creek showed you the earth, the next place aimed a little higher, right up into the stars. Rack's roast beef tried to be more than fast food. It wanted to be thoughtful, even elegant, an oasis for the roast beef connoisseur. And if that sounds like a joke now, back then, it was serious business. The logo had class. The menu had ambition. You could get a baked potato with real butter or pile your plate with pasta and pudding from the salad bar that stretched like a buffet dream. The roast beef sandwiches were stacked, the booths were plush, and in some locations, you could eat inside a glass atrium surrounded by artificial waterfalls and faux palm trees. Some even had a champagne room, which sounds wild until you remember it was the 1980s. But ambition sometimes runs into confusion, and Rack's never quite figured out if it wanted to be Arby's rich cousin or a full-blown sit-down experience. It tried to do too much, and in the end, it crumbled under the weight of its own salad bar. But speaking of places that loved doing too much, our next stop had popcorn on the floor, cartoons on the walls, and enough energy to fuel a second-grade birthday party. White Tower was a fast food chain that was founded in 1926, and it copied what was known as White Castle, which was another big name in the burger-making industry. They were known for these small white burgers, and they expanded heavily throughout the 20s and 30s. What they were known for most was that lightning-quick service. Seriously, I don't know what the hourly rate was back then for the service industry, but theirs must have been the best in the market, or at least pretty competitive, since those workers did their job like men possessed. You ever seen somebody move like Sonic the Hedgehog flipping hamburgers? A marathon, sure, but hamburgers? It's insane how different the work ethic used to be back then. Well, at least you could get paid fairly, so that's something. White Tower was known for having pretty good employee retention too, and it was one of the first chains to do a lot of things besides just set a standard in how you should treat your employees. It was extremely recognizable. Remember how I just talked about how Bob's Big Boy had its own air and personality that made it stand out? White Tower was really similar to that in that regard, and that's why no matter what the location was, it was always easily recognizable. Although maybe it was a bit too easy on the eyes, because people eventually compared it to another fast food chain, White Castle, and it even got into legal battles with them over how similar their product and architecture were. Guess you always should change up the homework you copy a bit more to be on the safe side, right? There was no intention to buy anything, and everyone knew it. The furniture store with the free popcorn machine was Dad's idea of a Saturday outing. You would walk in and get hit with that smell, leather, fresh carpet, and hot butter. Dad would head straight for the recliners, and you? Straight to the red and silver popcorn machine near the back. It was always humming, full of those little white bags that were supposed to be single-serve, but somehow you found a way to go back 5 times without getting caught. Meanwhile, Dad was doing his test sit. That meant stretching, sighing, and rocking the recliner back and forth like he was making a real decision. "Too stiff," he would say. "This one's a back killer." The sales guy always came over and Dad would nod along, arms crossed, like he was closing in on the deal of the century. But you knew he was not buying a couch, he just liked the idea of picking one. And that popcorn? It was better than movie theater popcorn because it was earned. All this to say, shopping never felt like shopping with Dad. It felt like a game. But speaking of buttons, lights, and games, let me tell you about the kind of place where Dad's inner nerd really came to life. Beefsteak Charlie's did not want you to just eat. They wanted you to feast. This was the kind of place that dared you to come hungry, then dared you again to leave room for dessert. Their tagline was, "You're gonna get spoiled," and honestly, they meant it. With a full salad bar, all-you-can-eat shrimp, and unlimited sangria, beer, and wine, it was less a dinner and more a challenge. The vibes? Equal parts wood-paneled steakhouse and slightly buzzed family reunion. People went for birthdays, promotions, divorces, any excuse to eat until your waistband begged for mercy. And the food? Surprisingly solid. The steak was not exactly filet mignon, but it hit the spot. The shrimp came fast and endless. And the bread? Warm, crusty, and forgettable. But who was there for bread? Beefsteak Charlie's rode the wave of 80s extravagance until the bottom line caught up with them. Too much generosity and not enough foot traffic sealed its fate. But in its heyday, it was a buffet fever dream come to life. So if you thought that was decadent, just wait. The next restaurant stripped the glitz and turned hot dogs and tacos into a Southern California classic, with a name that only made sense once you saw the menu. NFL Hall of Fame inductee. Gino Marchetti and some of his partners came together in 1957 and came up with Gino's Hamburgers, first opening for business in the humble locale of Baltimore, Maryland. However, not so humble, it quickly became a fast food giant in the region. It was even known as Gino Giant, and part of that was because of that extremely towering, intimidating double-decker burger that would make even most grown men think twice about whether or not they could finish it. Gino's Hamburgers market was grown men, though, because it also had team-oriented marketing that was meant to appeal to NFL fans. It even partnered with the NFL and created a lot of leeway and goodwill with local sports communities and fans, and it even featured KFC chicken thanks to a licensing partnership with them. They had an approach to the fast food game that no one else had at the time, which was to build a solid community fan base and take full advantage of it. That dedication to regional success is still something that's echoed by a lot of fast food joints across America, and Gino's legacy lives on in all the places it's influenced. The flea market at the county fairgrounds was not just an event. It was an ecosystem. Hot pavement under your feet, the smell of popcorn mixing with motor oil, and a wall of voices haggling like they were at a medieval bazaar. Dad had a game plan. He always did. First, a lap to scout, then back around to make the real choices. You wandered behind him wide-eyed, marveling at tables full of license plates, rusted tools, vintage comic books, and a surprising amount of questionable homemade jerky. One guy sold nothing but bumper stickers with sayings that would get you sent to the principal's office. Another had rows of toy yo-yos. And even though Dad warned you, you begged for one anyway. It broke in 5 minutes, maybe 6, but you still carried it around like it was gold. There was always a booth with used records blaring classic rock through dusty speakers, and Dad would flip through the crates like he was searching for buried treasure. Every once in a while, he would hold one up and say, "Now this is music." You did not argue. Not when he looked that happy. And if you thought flea markets were a lawless land of loose change and sunburns, just wait until you hear about the go-kart track that somehow never got shut down. Sambo's restaurant was once everywhere. At its peak, over 1,000 locations dotted the American map, and for a time, it was the breakfast joint. You walked in, saw the tiger stripe motif, and knew pancakes were on the way. The food was solid. Fluffy pancakes, greasy bacon, big mugs of diner coffee. The kind of breakfast that left you needing a nap by 10 in the morning. But Sambo's legacy is tangled. Its name and branding, drawn from a children's book with racist origins, sparked increasing backlash as public awareness and cultural conversations shifted. People started asking hard questions about what a restaurant should represent. The food stayed consistent, but the reputation cracked. One by one, locations closed or rebranded. And while the last original Sambos held on until 2020, even it finally changed names. Still, to many who grew up in its booths, it was not about the name. It was about pancake mornings with family and kids' meals with tiger-striped coloring books. But from syrupy stacks to something a little more British, the next forgotten favorite took a trip across the Atlantic and served up deep-fried nostalgia with a dash of malt vinegar. A name that was founded during the glory days of Lums and ended up giving it some serious competition was Steak and Ale, which actually went on the other end of the spectrum. Norman Binker, the founder, built the first steak and ale in Dallas, Texas. The way this contrasted from places like Lums was that while they focused on experimental food and new ideas that Americans wouldn't get at other places, Steak and Ale doubled down on the concept of how much Americans love a good steak. The problem was that around this time period, a lot of families were still recovering from the back-to-back effects of the historically disastrous cluster of events known as the Great Depression and the two World Wars, so there was a need for restaurants to be affordable if they wanted to keep dragging in customers. Steak and Ale was the pioneer of this kind of steakhouse, and it featured traditional American themes and an atmosphere that screamed Texas, almost as if the walls themselves were saying howdy to you. Prime rib, steaks, pork roasts, all for prices that the competition couldn't keep up with. And then, to top it all off, an all-you-can-eat salad bar that was so popular with both people who were trying to keep in shape and kids who loved experimenting with different wacky salad combinations. Steakhouses were known for being pricey, fancy places you'd take the family out to, so Steak and Ale really did customers a favor by introducing the idea of an affordable steakhouse. The strip mall pet store did not smell like adventure. It smelled like wood shavings and fish food. But when Dad said, "Let's stop in for a minute," you knew it meant 20. The walls were lined with glass tanks full of turtles, frogs, and fish that looked too bright to be real. You would press your nose against the glass and point. "That one. I want that one." Dad would shake his head and smile. "We're not getting a turtle." 5 minutes later, you were holding a goldfish in a plastic bag, trying not to spill it on the seat of the car. He was not a pushover. He just knew the power of a memory. And that pet store, as humble as it was, felt like a mini zoo to you. There was always one sleepy lizard under a heat lamp and a parrot that squawked like a broken doorbell. Sometimes you would hear, "Hey there," from across the room and realize the bird was mocking you. Dad would strike up a conversation with the guy behind the counter like they were old war buddies, swapping advice on filters and food pellets. You would head home with a tank, a packet of food, and a new responsibility you were not quite ready for. And when you were ready for something outdoorsy, Dad knew just the place, with canoes and no life jackets in sight. Arthur Treacher's Fish and Chips felt like someone dropped a British pub right into the middle of American suburbia, minus the beer and with a lot more deep frying. Named after the dapper English actor known for playing butlers in old films, this spot promised the classic British fish and chips experience, but with a crispy, golden American twist. The fish, flaky, crunchy, and always steaming. The chips, thick-cut fries that could double as a side or a meal, depending on how hungry you were. And do not forget the little tubs of malt vinegar that gave the whole meal a tangy kick. It was greasy comfort food at its finest, wrapped in paper and handed over with a wink. In its heyday, Arthur Treacher's had hundreds of locations scattered across the country. It was the place for people who wanted something fried but just a little different than burgers or chicken. Over time, competition and changing tastes wore it down. Most locations shuttered, leaving only a handful hanging on. But for anyone who grew up with one nearby, the smell of fried cod and vinegar still triggers a flood of memories. And speaking of memories, the next place on our list serves them up by the tray, with old-school charm, a flat-top grill, and a name that still rings out across the Midwest. VIP's ended up being a chain of diner-style restaurants that was based in the Pacific Northwest, and it was founded in 1968 in Oregon. VIP's served ranges of classic American staples, which made it real popular with the middle-aged crowd that was slowly fading away into their twilight years. Burgers, beers, breakfast items, sandwiches. It was known for being family-friendly, which I'm sure you can tell a lot of these places were by now. That was just what the market was like. The biggest money was to be made with families, and a lot of diner restaurants focused on them. Also, because catering to families meant that one person could bring along 3 others with them if they suggested your spot as an idea, as compared to fast food places that would have menus better enjoyed on your own. It also followed in the footsteps of Wags, being one of the first players that were a part of the wave of 24-hour style diner restaurants. Later on, VIP would be acquired by Denny's, but even on its own, it became a regional hit in the Northwest as a lot of people could rely on it for consistent quality, affordable meals, and an atmosphere that was perfect for a relaxing night out on the town with your wife and kids. The go-kart track with 0 safety rules looked like it was built by someone who once saw a racetrack in a dream and then tried to recreate it with duct tape and a prayer. The sign out front read, "Family Fun." But you knew this was Dad's kind of fun. He paid cash to a man with a sunburn and a clipboard, and before you knew it, you were strapping into a plastic rocket with wheels. No seatbelt, no helmet, just a stern warning. Do not hit your sister. Dad, of course, was already in his own cart, revving the engine like it was the Daytona 500. The track was a cracked loop with grass growing through it and tires stacked too high as a boundary. The exhaust fumes were strong enough to water your eyes, and the cart screeched like a choir of angry lawnmowers. You skidded, bumped, and spun out more than once, but you never forgot the thrill, especially when Dad passed you on the last lap, one hand on the wheel, the other waving smugly. That victory lap? It lasted all week, and if you were lucky, he would let you stay just a little longer, because the community swap meet down at the church lot was about to open, and Dad never missed that one. Gino's Hamburgers was one of those places that felt like it had everything. A solid burger, crispy fried chicken, a shake thick enough to challenge your straw. But the best part? It was co-founded by an actual National Football League Hall of Famer, Gino Marchetti of the Baltimore Colts. That kind of crossover was rare back then, and people loved it. The logo even had a little football player flipping a spatula like he had just sacked your hunger. Gino's was particularly big on the East Coast. You would see the glowing red signs as you drove past shopping centers and think, yeah, we are stopping there. It had this casual charm, nothing too flashy, but dependable in a way that stuck with you. They even teamed up with Kentucky Fried Chicken for a while. You could get your burger and your bucket in one place. That is efficiency, 1980s style. Eventually, though, bigger names moved in, and Gino's fizzled out, with only a couple of locations hanging on in Pennsylvania and Maryland today. But ask anyone who grew up nearby and they will tell you, it was the real deal. And if Gino's was about hearty plates and gridiron glory, then our next stop was about indulgence. Lots of it. Shrimp by the pound, steak on demand, and wine that flowed freely. Stuart and Clifford Pearlman became famous for something that no amount of forewarning can prepare you for, so I'm just going to say it outright. They came up with this place called Lums, and Lums was the boss at serving hot dogs steamed in beer. Yes, you heard that exactly correct. They would serve hot dogs that had been doused and steamed in beer, and it actually was heavenly. Lums was supposed to be a hot dog stand that was family-focused, but it eventually expanded its own menu to include other things too, such as fried seafood dishes like fried prawns and shrimp and burgers. Lums was one of the last few places with a vibe that was considered vintage and retro back then, though the time period we're talking about is what we consider that to be now. This is because the atmosphere of most of its locations actually just felt like an old-school tavern, and that attracted a lot of folk. Despite starting towards the end of the 1950s, it actually had an exponential growth rate. Lums ended up having more than 500 locations nationwide, and it was one of the first places that played around with the idea of experimental food attracting diners who were looking for something new that they couldn't get anywhere else. Radio Shack. You did not go to Radio Shack to shop. You went there to touch. The moment you walked through the door, it was like stepping onto a spaceship. Racks of wires, batteries, and gadgets you had never even heard of. And in the middle of it all, the demo table, a flashing, beeping paradise. Dad would say, "We're just browsing," but an hour later, he was still pressing buttons, turning knobs, and pretending he was building a satellite in the garage. You would find the mini keyboard and try to play "Mary Had a Little Lamb" while he talked tech with the teenage clerk behind the counter. Every once in a while, he would point at something and say, "I had one of these back in college," even if he definitely did not. He would pick up a transistor radio, weigh it in his hand like a jeweler inspecting a rare gem, and give a long, low whistle. Solid piece of work. He never bought anything over $20, but you always walked out feeling like you had been part of a NASA mission. If imagination had a store, it was that one. And right around the corner from that tech wonderland, a pet store where you begged and somehow always walked out with something in a plastic bag. Long before Auntie Anne's took over shopping malls with that sweet almond glaze and cinnamon sugar swagger, there was Hot Sam Pretzels. This place was the original mall pretzel joint. The smell hit you like a buttery wall the moment you walked in. Their pretzels were big, doughy, salty, and piping hot. Perfect for tearing apart with your bare hands in between trips to the arcade and the food court. What made Hot Sam special was that it felt like it had always been there. You never planned to go to Hot Sam. You just walked past, caught a whiff, and suddenly you were standing in line. The classic salted pretzel was the favorite, but if you were bold, you went for the cheese-stuffed or even the jalapeno variety. They did not have 20 sauces or dipping cups. They had mustard. That was it. And it was glorious. Eventually, the brand got merged with Pretzel Time, and later, Auntie Anne's took over the pretzel game for good. But for kids of the 80s, Hot Sam was the flavor of an afternoon well spent. Speaking of things that left a taste and a legacy, our next stop is a little more complicated. A pancake house turned national chain, now remembered as much for controversy as it is for maple syrup. Bob's Big Boy ended up being founded in 1936 by Bob Wien in Glendale, California, and it actually preceded Gino's and made a big name for itself at Gino's Own Game, which was having one unforgettable, phenomenal double-decker burger. This thing would turn even the staunchest of anti-beef believers into burger fans. I wasn't around back then, but my parents were, and they've seen that happen in real time. It also became known for something else my parents would never stop telling me about as they rant about how mascot culture is dead. That something was the Big Boy mascot statue, which is what people started to associate the restaurant with. It really gave it a sense of identity and a personal brand that set it apart from just another fast food place. Having an air of uniqueness like that can really help draw in customers, and if you're aiming to be a successful diner, you can never have enough of that. Bob's Big Boy ended up influencing a lot of diner culture, as its focus on a wide range of items like breakfast options such as sandwiches and comfort food go-tos like hash browns and burgers would make it known for being a family-oriented spot you could go to for a good, affordable meal. This is the same vibe and model that places like Denny's try to capture now. It was not advertised. It was not even on a main road. Just a crooked wooden sign and a driveway that dipped behind an overgrown hedge. But if Dad tapped the wheel twice and said, "Here we are," you knew it was magic. The model train store in the back of someone's garage was no bigger than a single-car stall, but inside, it felt like a kingdom. Shelves were packed to the rafters with tiny train cars, tracks, tunnels, even tiny trees with even tinier squirrels. The air smelled like dust and old metal, the kind of smell that never leaves your coat. You would lean in to watch the train circle a miniature mountain range while Dad made small talk with the gray-haired man in suspenders, who clearly ran the whole operation on nothing but love and nostalgia. "This one's from 1952, the man would say, handing Dad a coal car like it was a rare coin. You did not know what made it special. You just knew Dad's eyes lit up in that way he saved for fishing trips and baseball games. It was not just a store. It was a secret clubhouse for grown men who still believed in toy engines and pretend towns. And if you think that was charming, wait until you smell what comes next. Free popcorn at the furniture store. Which of these names did you grow up with? And which ones still echo when you close your eyes? If this brought back even one forgotten memory, leave a comment, tap like, and subscribe.